Okay, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Raj, I want to kick off this conversation by actually flashing back to the COVID-19 pandemic. We obviously saw e-commerce growth skyrocket during this time. What did you see when it came to fraud, which is your specialty here?
Yeah, thank you. Let me start by sort of just sharing a little bit about what the fraud world looks like and then sort of bring it to the pandemic a bit. Most of us, and I'm sure you've experienced this, you're traveling somewhere new to a new country and you decide to buy something and you swipe your credit card and you get declined. And you're sitting there thinking, why did I get my transaction being turned away? And you get a call from your bank saying, hey, we think fraud's happened on your credit card. And you're looking at that and trying to make a decision on saying, okay, did it really look like it was fraud or not? But you know it was a good transaction that's turned away. Most consumers have experienced that at some point in their life. If you look at it from a retail perspective, though, most retailers have to think about this problem a lot more of declining certain transactions because ultimately the retailer is liable for a bad transaction. They have to pay for it. And so what happens in the mix is that because they're afraid of the fraud and the liability that comes with it, they end up declining a lot of good transactions. And today, if you look at the world, billions of dollars, anywhere from 1% to 20% of all e-commerce is turned away, not because it's actually fraud,
Wow.
but because people think it's fraud. And that problem got exacerbated during the pandemic for multiple reasons. And we can talk about some of the examples, but effectively new forms of digital behavior started to come into the mix. One, you couldn't sell in your store anymore. You saw new demographics coming online, and therefore you ended up having more good people being turned away because your traditional ways of doing things had not seen all of this before.
Right, and so how did retailers adjust to that, and what role did Signifyd play in that major shift through COVID?
Yeah. One of the great sort of examples to look at in this space when you saw the transformation during the pandemic was all about Omni-channel. Take that as a good example. More and more stores were being shut down because they couldn't have people in the store from a COVID perspective and being able to shop in store. And so they said, well, how can we leverage the stores to be able to buy online, but instead of just deliver from store, pick up at curbside or pick up at store? Mm-hmm. And your traditional ways of dealing with fraud at that time were very rules-based. And what that means is that somebody wrote a specific rule that said, hey, if somebody buys something but it goes to the same shipping address 15 times, I want you to decline that transaction. Or they would say something like that if you're looking at this transaction for the first time, I need to push it into a manual review because I've not seen this particular buyer. And so there were humans looking at it, and it could take 48 to 72 hours for someone to review that transaction and make a decision. That's not a great consumer experience, effectively. Like if I buy online and I want to pick up, I'm not going to wait 72 hours to get that. I want to go there in the next 1 hour to pick it up.
Right.
And so where Signifyd played a significant impact is we make these decisions without a rules-based approach. Our machine makes a decision on it, and we're trying to say, just because you're seeing the consumer for the first time, or they're putting an order in where there's all of these being picked up at a single address, which is a store, doesn't mean that that's a bad person, and therefore we can make instant decisions that allow people to be able to accept transactions faster.
So essentially, someone like my mom, who hadn't been shopping online before that much, she wasn't getting declined through the pandemic.
That's essentially right. When we were talking about this too, like my mom, as a good example, had never shopped online before. She was very much, for her groceries, she would always go into a physical store and she would always buy her stuff. Pandemic hit, she decided to move online for the first time and start buying her groceries. But the moment she did that, she's a buyer that no one had seen online before, and you don't want to treat that first-time buyer as a bad buyer. You want to give them the best experience they can get and improve as much as you can, not only for the revenue for the business, but also for the customer lifetime value that you're trying to deliver.
Right, and so one of the companies that you worked with here in Canada was Toys R Us, which obviously shifted its model over to offer that curbside pickup. What was that partnership like for you?
It's a great story, and one of the great things that Toys R Us did during the pandemic was leverage the physical stores to be as valuable as possible. Now, who thinks about I need to get my toy as fast as I need to get my pizza? Not a lot of people think of it. It's a very forward-looking thinking to be able to say I want to be able to deliver something like that with their partnerships with DoorDash and such. But one of the things that had to happen at that time, if you're delivering from store or pick up from store, was being able to manage that instant decision while also not having the downside of fraud. And I believe they went from a 10% to almost a 90% pickup in store, which they previously didn't have. And that massive growth that they saw had to come with a good solution to be able to be more focused on the lifetime value of the customer.
Right.
Yeah.
And another thing that you saw through the pandemic was the consumer abuse side of things in terms of fraud. And so how has Signifyd played a role in helping retailers deal with that?
And this is a great, when you look at abuse, there's multiple forms of abuse, typically. The two types that people look at is when you buy something and then claim you never received it, just acting like you never received it, and then you file a chargeback with the company and you try to win your money back. And then the second type of abuse is you asked for a particular type of product, but you didn't get the right product, and instead of giving it back, you sort of file a chargeback and get into a dispute process with someone in this whole thing. From a Signifyd perspective, we're able to identify and help merchants up front when someone is in abusive behavior or exhibiting abusive behavior by looking at a lot of the signals in those transactions. And so we've looked at, if you look at the data out there, item not received is a huge growing problem, even with the future of what's happening in the world. And we're able to detect that early on and predict who's going to be sort of an abusive person and help retailers prevent that from happening in the first place.
And so what have you seen out there in the market today? Because we are obviously in a different place than we were 2 years ago. What are you seeing out there in terms of fraud and the trends around fraud?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think retailers have to start getting prepared for a little bit of a new world. But generally, there are three things that become pre-indicators of what is to come for retail. And this shows in the data we look at. We put out a report on a very regular basis, which is called the Signifyd Pulse report, that looks at retail across the board and tells you about these changing trends. And so I'll talk about a few of those trends. The first is just fraud pressure as a whole has gone up about 50% year over year.
Wow.
Fraud pressure is an interesting internal sort of like metric, but to just simplify it for the audience, think of if I'm buying toilet paper versus I'm buying a diamond. If I'm a fraudster, I'm going to attack you less if you're selling toilet paper. I'm going to attack you more if you're selling diamonds, right? And therefore, the fraud pressure, depending on the product, is going to be sort of different. So that's gone up 50%. The second thing is when you look at the abusive part of things, but going a little bit into just the types of chargeback claims that are coming in, you're seeing an increase, 40 to 50% increase in item not received and snag chargeback, simply because you have buyer's remorse. You know, in a world where we're going into more of a tighter market, if you will, consumers are going to think about, I bought this, but I didn't really want it. It was not what I wanted to do. Let me go file a chargeback. And so buyer's remorse is increasing. And then the third piece is just you're starting to see a lot more of account takeovers beginning to happen. And if you look at the number of things we've seen in the data, that's up close to 300% on an annual basis, where people are saying, well, I can take over these accounts and commit fraud. Let me do as much of that as I can, because this is the moment in time to be able to leverage and abuse accounts. The fraud side of things on stolen cards are being taken, but the weak is at the account level. And so how can we go after that? I think those are the main ones that we're seeing.
So essentially, in this environment that we find ourselves in, where inflation is persisting, we've got interest rates that are rising, and of course, geopolitical tensions that are trickling down in some unexpected ways, that this environment is actually potentially fueling more fraud.
It definitely is fueling more fraud. And you know, I think this is hard to predict. If we all were really clear about the future, we would be in Vegas, not on the collision stage. But the point is, you've got a few things that are happening in the world because of everything else. One is supply chain is getting to be tighter. people are taking a longer time to get their product, or the suppliers of pieces that help them build the product is taking a lot longer to make happen. The second one is people are losing jobs for, obviously, some are leaving for their own sake, but there are companies that are laying off, and you're starting to see a tougher job market. In those moments, people break out to find ways to make a living. No one wakes up thinking they want to commit fraud, but fraudsters have found a way to do things like, I don't know if you've heard about the dating scams out there, where people date people, but they ask you to buy things for them, and you're a passive mule in this whole thing. You don't even know that you're committing fraud in the mix. And so you're starting to see an increase in behaviors, early indicators that tell you this is going to happen. And on the retail side, like if you think about merchants in general, they're starting to tighten up because cost is important. They have to maximize their OpEx to be able to survive. And growth is not growth at all costs. So if you're growing at 5 to 8% as a business, but you're declining, let's say, 2 or 3% of your business because you think it's fraud, one of the growth levers in the business for retail automatically becomes unwinding everything you currently do and saying, why don't we just offer up something that approves more while taking the liability away from the merchant?
Right. So what else should retailers be doing right now to prepare themselves for this and make sure that they are being as efficient as possible when it comes to tackling this issue?
Yeah, and I highlighted a couple, and it's just to kind of frame it. I think the number one thing when retail as a whole is sort of in the state it is, first, everyone's in a good space right now, simply because more and more is going to be moving online. So I think the tailwind is really good for the e-commerce industry. The problem is going to be with supply chain and cost and managing during this period of time and how you do all of it. I think one of the best things retailers can do is look at their rules-based approaches, the current archaic approaches that they have in the market to decline a lot of good users, and find a way to approve more using products that are more machine-based than just rules-based. That drives a lot of growth for them. If they're a retailer that has to look at a 5% growth, as I mentioned, if you can get half of that from just unwinding and using the money you're using to already attract good users, why not just drive that and sort of drive the growth that you need to drive in the future?
And so you still, so that we're not just talking doom and gloom on this panel, you still see some opportunity out there for retailers to get better at this point in time?
I think it's a very positive environment. Yes, there's doom and gloom in many ways that people always consider, but this is the best time to really build efficiency in the business if you're in retail. And one of the best places to invest is in your conversion funnel. And most people miss the conversion funnel in the fraud piece. And so I think it's a huge opportunity for retail right now.
And that's a role that Signifyd can step into?
I don't want to pitch Signifyd on the stage, but obviously, yes, we are a big part of this funnel. We are helping optimizing that funnel. But if you look at the big picture and clearly kind of understand where this plays, merchants are spending millions and millions of dollars on CAC and acquiring a new customer. As you bring that consumer in and you turn them away, you've spent all these marketing dollars to acquire it. Why can't you find a way to convert more of them so that they become lifelong customer, high-value customers for you in the mix? And we do play a big part in that.
And while we have you here, just talking about consumer fraud, what is your advice just for people that are on the lookout for this, that have experienced it? What do you have to say to them?
For the retailers or for the
consumers?
For the consumers.
Yeah.
I'd advise the 2 or 3 main things everybody talks about. One is look at your card statements to see where fraud happens. Oftentimes, you don't recognize that frauds happen. I always go back to the story of my life and how I got into fraud. But I'm a big Taco Bell fan, and I still do it. But back in the day, I got a call from the economics crime division in Memphis, and they said, you have fraud on your account, we're going to shut your card down. I used to live in Memphis, Tennessee. I looked at that, and I'm like, why is fraud happening on this? And it found out that the person at the Taco Bell counter was collecting cards and then going off to the home shopping network and buying a ton of things. And it fascinated me that the home shopping network could be able to connect the dots by just looking at all this pattern of behavior. And that led me to build this at FedEx, helped me to build it at PayPal, and then helped me to build this at Signifyd. But it's you have to be aware, you need to be vigilant, you can't assume everybody's doing it, but the good news is the consumer is always protected, and mostly it's a nuisance of having to change things up again and again on your site, like replace the card or something of that sort. So.
Okay, Raj, well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you all for attending this session.